Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming. And it's quite an experience and an honor for me to be part of this panel with my good friend and comic book hero BJARKE and my lifelong inspirer Brian ENO. So this is quite big for me as well. And I think this talk is interesting because putting you people together, it was not my idea. I think it's a good idea. I think it's part of the signature of this festival. This festival is quite different. And walking around here in this kaleidoscope of art and food and music, it seems both very utopian, futuristic, almost a perfect way to consume culture and art. But there's also a grand old castle, and it also reminds me of something almost aristocratic. I think we feel, kind of posh to be walking around here almost. So I want to open this by asking you, Brian, seeing this festival, seeing all these different expressions of human invention, creativity, what does it say? Why do we feel the need to do this? And why have we been doing this for so long, creating and consuming art and culture?
Thank you. Thank you all very much for coming, and once again, thank you to Caroline and Michael for putting this on. And thank God the weather has been good. So the question you asked is actually, funnily enough, the question that has been obsessing me since I was about 17 years old. When I was 17, I had a girlfriend who had a very, very intelligent mother. And that mother became my sort of guru for some years. And she was very interested in the sciences. She had a sort of salon in Cambridge where scientists would come. I met Francis Crick there and John Kendrew and Enrico Fermi and a lot of amazing scientists. And she liked me. And one day she sat me down and she said, "I don't understand why somebody with a brain as good as yours is going to waste it being an artist." And that set me wondering why one would want to be an artist and why we want art, in fact. Why don't we just all do science? Science obviously produces results. We all live with those results. They're all around us. Science is practical, makes good sense, and it's very inspiring too. It's not unimaginative or anything like that. It's not dull. So I started thinking about this question of what do artists do and why do we want artists? Why do we want art? Now, I could consume the rest of this 50 minutes and the next 2 or 3 days answering that question, so I shouldn't go too far into it, but I started to think that what science did, the difference between science and art, was that science was really interested in trying to find out how this world works. If you ask any scientist what they're doing, they'll say, "Well, I'm just fascinated by spectacles, so I just really want to see how they worked." Or, "I'm fascinated by water, I really want to understand water." If you ask artists what they're doing, they generally tell you to bugger off, or they don't really have an answer to the question. They say, "I just like doing it." So you say, "But why do you like doing it?" And what you realize is that what artists like is to build new worlds of some kind, unfamiliar worlds. They want to build other possible realities. And in doing that, understand something about this reality, reflect back on this reality. So this is a very, very, very poor answer to that question, but the long answer takes a long time, and it divides into 5 different parts. That was just the prelude to part 1.
Well, I think even though I would actually like that, I think it would be too bad for BJARKE if we actually spent the entire 50 minutes with one answer. But I know that it's one of your big subjects. One of the things you've been working with is this general idea. But seeing it here, do you think the way we consume art in this way, in this venue, has changed since, let's say, not 2,000 years ago, but 10,000 years ago, or even 50,000 years ago, because we know humans produced art, and we know they did it in special places and for special occasions. So do you think this is actually all that novel, or is it just a new frame?
Well, something that I find very, very interesting and that not many people know is that the human brain has been shrinking for at least the last 20,000 years. So the human brain is about 15% smaller now than it was 20,000 years ago. Now, in evolutionary time, that's a very short time for such a very big change. So there are a lot of questions about why that happened. My own theory is that it's because we don't need so much brain, because we share so much of everybody else's. If you think of 20,000 years ago, you had to be a complete individual. You had to be able to catch food, prepare food, defend yourself. You had to do a whole lot of different things. Now you can afford just to be a bloody musician. I don't have to understand anything else. I know how to repair a bicycle, but aside from that, I can't really do anything else. You know, I don't know how to grow food. I don't know how to build a house. He might. I don't know how to do many of the things that I need to survive, but I borrow everybody else's brain. So although my personal brain is smaller than 20,000 years ago, my collective brain is enormous. So one of the things I think culture is doing is somehow exercising that collective brain. It's the conversation that collective brain is having. This is the prelude to section 2 of my answer, by the way.
We might get through the preludes at least.
Actually, this thing about the collective, there's a book called The Rational Optimist that you probably know, that starts with this like nice image of a hand axe and a mouse, like a computer mouse and a hand axe. There's like sort of I think like 10,000 years between them, but one is created by a single individual by manipulating a single material with his hands until it became the axe he wanted. The other one, no single human being alive on the planet today would be able to create it, because it involves so many sort of professions, so many sciences, so many skill sets, that it's only because we somehow invented distribution of labor and collaboration that we are capable of undertaking like so massive things, including building cathedrals or traveling to other planets. And then I think the second thing of what you said, I was thinking about, you said like, why do we need, why would a smart person become an artist, and what's the purpose of art? And you know, Nietzsche, he came up with the concept of the artist philosopher, which was the idea, instead of being sort of almost like an arch librarian governing eternal truth, the philosopher became a creative thinker that created new concepts that we could use to advance our life and our society. And I think I always describe architecture, I always describe it as the art and science of creating the world we would like to live in. And in a way, I like this idea of pragmatic utopia, where you try to imagine the world the way you wish it was, and then you literally try to sit down and build it.
So I like that very much. When I really felt I started making music was when I thought I was making the music that belonged to the future that I wanted to live in. So I tried to imagine this world that I wanted to live in and the music that you would have there. And the music didn't exist when I had this idea, so I had to make it. And that was really where things like Music for Airports came from. They came from projecting a future that I hoped to create by building some of the objects that belonged in that future. Do you see what I mean? So I thought, if you put the objects there, even though the rest of the future didn't exist, it would start to grow around those objects. That was the plan.
But actually, like,
has it worked?
It did.
I think there's another thing there, which is the sometimes the expectations. Because I've obviously noticed that a lot of your music has this like cinematic quality, and like creating these like almost like landscapes or like very rich, dense atmospheres. And you talked about that when you were a kid, you listened a lot to movie soundtracks, film soundtracks, and you would, without having seen the films, and it reminded me because of I wanted to be a cartoonist when I was a kid, and I used to. Because I didn't have an allowance enough to buy all the graphic novels that I wanted, so I would go to the local bookstore and then I would like flip through them, but like not long enough to really read them and get kicked out, but more like sort of enough to sort of get a good feeling. But like somehow when I finally like put together the cash to acquire a certain one, then the actual story could no way live up to my anticipation of like what all this imagery could actually be.
Yeah. Well, this is always the problem people have when they read a book and then see the film. Because, of course, when you're reading, your imagination is painting a picture which perfectly suits you. And when you go and see the film, it's somebody else's picture. Yeah, well, I mean, the imagination of a child is really so fertile, and it takes about 11 years of education to really get rid of it. You know.
But I think the interesting thing is also that there's one difference between the objects you can use, the mouse or the hand axe, and what we're talking about. Because even though people can hopefully live in the houses you build, Bjarke, you actually have ambitions to do something else with it. So there's that, besides making something very convenient, well-functioning, and properly designed, and actually creating stuff that nobody said they could use before you started imagining it. For example, your music for the future, which was basically your own idée fixe that you just worked on. What do you think? Why do you think there's that? Or what is the driving force between, making food that tastes more than just good? This is a place where, for example, we are researching food that tastes novel and new and almost otherworldly, the food of the future. And that extra urge, you could build straight up houses. You started your career being actually criticized for not doing that. What's that extra thing? Why do we have that urge?
Well, isn't the biggest thrill to find yourself somewhere that you didn't expect to be? To create a situation that suddenly surprises you. That's what jokes are all about, I think as an artist, you're constantly trying to create a punchline that you didn't expect. And as a cook, actually, the funny thing about cooking, I realized listening to Ruthie Rogers last night, is, of course, it's quite restricted in a way as an art form, because it wouldn't be very successful if people vomited when they ate it, or threw it away, or something like that. You have to have some sort of envelope of acceptability. And of course, there's a limit to the number of ingredients you can use. As yet, you can't use coal and tar and gasoline in your cooking, as yet.
In small doses.
I'm sure someone's working on it right now. But the thrill is taking these familiar things and suddenly doing something surprising and different with it. But I don't think that's that different from what artists are doing all the time. Just saying, hey, you thought you understood this, check this out. You thought you understood all the black notes on the piano, which is basically what a lot of my music is. That's the terrible secret. So don't repeat it beyond this room.
I taught my kids they could just press them and then it sounds, if they hold down the sustain pedal at the same time, then you're done.
Brian Eno's career.
No, but actually, one thing about why you don't, as an architect, just make the nicest building that has already been built and then just make another one of them.
Right.
And maybe make it slightly better. I mean, it was almost the recipe of Arne Jacobsen, like this amazing architect. He took, he took the Lever House in New York, and then he built it as Hotel Royal in Copenhagen, and he just detailed it slightly better. But I think the reason that there is an invitation to go beyond, and they call this conversation instruments of change, which you find is actually, it is that the world has already evolved a little bit since the last time someone tried. And so I think the role of in this case the architect, but the person being creative, is actually to not so much to impose his or her will, but rather to open the ears and the eyes and be ready to embrace this new little ingredient that, when accommodated, it's like it can actually lead to a whole new direction. And that's where it's not some random variation or some eccentric twist. It's really rather like one more step in a direction where we're going. And I like this idea that William Gibson, the science fiction writer, he has a quote where he says, "The future is already here. It's just very unevenly distributed." And that's like, when you whenever you like get a new challenge, and I think this would be true in music also, there might be available instruments or available technologies. There might also be, you might have rediscovered more vernacular or sort of indigenous instruments or sounds that you hadn't been aware of before. And the same in architecture, like what was common sense half a year ago is now, there's a completely new possibility. Actually, sometimes you talk about skilled incompetence when in an organization that faces change, is that when you're so good at what you do, you already know the answer before you even started questioning the situation.
This is one of your main themes, though, right? This is one of your main themes. You've always called yourself a non-musician, and insisted on the amateuric approach to a certain extent.
Yeah, well, in fact, I had a very good vindication of that tonight. I saw the band Low playing. I really, really liked what they did. And I thought, here you have three musicians who probably would not claim to be great musicians. And yet, somehow, the three of them make a fantastic kind of music. I'm sure, I don't want to insult them by saying they're not great musicians, but I don't think they will be, Brian. Think they would make that claim about themselves. I sincerely hope not, because I'd be very embarrassed if they... But they clearly have something that you only ever find in rock music, which is where people who don't do something very well end up producing something amazingly beautiful occasionally. That's a real mystery. That doesn't happen in classical music at all. It doesn't happen in classical art, actually, in any way at all. This is why there's something different about this new music, I think.
But well, looking back, classical, of course, to a lot of people means old-fashioned. But you're actually getting at something that's maybe even more fundamental than classical art. I mean, historically speaking, if we go beyond classical, if we go back to the really old days, that seems to maybe have been the general mode of the artist, almost as a shaman or a societal figure, to not be the perfectionist, but be somebody trying, often in a communal or a group situation, to create something that has that fundamental, you could say, rock energy. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, you can think of an artist in two different ways. You can either think of him as someone who's trying to communicate something. That's so you imagine the artist with a kind of big megaphone, and she's shouting a message at you, and if you're lucky, you'll get the message at the other end. That's one vision of the artist. That's sort of classical vision of the artist, that the artist is a sort of channel for something that comes from the divine and out to the masses, you lot. But another image of the artist, and the one that I prefer, is of somebody who is a kind of trigger to set something going in a culture. And I have this word which I've used a lot, which is scenius, S-C-E-N-I-U-S. So classically there's the idea of the genius, Beethoven, Bach, Shakespeare, Picasso. the genius, the person with the huge brain who walks around with symphonies and masterpieces in their head. And the more you start to look at the history of art, the more you realize this is not true. That every time you find somebody like Picasso or Shakespeare or whoever else, they are part of a very complicated scene of people who are supporting each other and generating ideas together. So I think that should have a name. The name for the fertile culture I call Asenius. So it's the communal form of genius. And I more and more want to get away from that. This is against my own interests, I'm arguing here. I want to get away from that idea of the gifted and separate individual and to try to think of the culture as a kind of ecology where lots and lots of people are important. For example, to give you an idea, since we're here now, this festival is an ecology of some kind, and there are lots of people involved in it. Obviously Caroline and Michael, who set it going, but then all the other people who are making this thing work in all their different ways. To start taking them away, it wouldn't work. It works as a unit, you know. It's not a hierarchy that's making this work.
But in that understanding, the classical idea of art is basically a somewhat neurotic period of history then, of a period where we had this false idea that
yeah.
And I mean, especially also in rock journalism, and I think, I mean, the way they talk about the star architect as well.
Yeah.
This is the general mythological idea of the artist as someone creating all of it at once.
Well,
sorry. No, because I think I think it's just maybe an understanding of if you give up the idea of the lone artist as being the single source, and maybe rather think about, because I mean, my experience is also that the individuals that do shine, and quite often it doesn't take more than like one person or one group to break the barrier, and then it's like a floodgate that opens up and it liberates and it raises an entire community. And you see that the sort of I've been working with architecture for the last 20-30 years, and the sort of the mecca of architecture has been moving around, but always triggered like by like one or two groups. But then it created this whole sort of undergrowth. But I do think that where the individual and I think both music and even more architecture is a very collective enterprise. It requires hundreds and hundreds of people to build a building. That the leader, let's say, who is often accredited with the work, is maybe the person who enables the collaboration in the most productive way. And I normally work with this idea that, because it's also false to say that it's all about process and it's all about like the group, because it's not a democracy and we never vote in our office, for instance. But it's neither a dictatorship, because it's not like just because I say so. So we like this. I like this idea of a meritocracy, where it's the idea put forward that merits the most that ends up rising to the surface. And you can say my job as the creative director is not necessarily to come up with that idea, although I would want to as much as anyone with a, you know, yeah, but yeah,
an echo.
It's like it's a duet. But actually to make sure, it's my job to make sure that it is the greatest idea that merits the most that actually ends up getting built, regardless of who came up with it. So I think in that sense, maybe this idea of the artist as a midwife,
the artist
rather than as a single source.
Or even as a shaman. I mean, the shaman's role is never to sit on top of the village and decide what everybody does. They live on the outskirts. They're both outcast and elevated to a certain extent, because they are there for the benefit of that process. But of course, as you say, it has to be that guy because he's best at it. Then they get the result.
For instance, like in sociology, they you talk about emerging leadership. Naturally, emerging leadership comes from the individual in the group that manages to capture the concerns and dreams of the most in the group. Therefore, the group will naturally gravitate towards that person. And that could be for all kinds of reasons. It could be either chance that this person just happens to be the one who wants what most people can sign up for, or it can be a certain empathy that allows this person to channel that. And you could imagine in art, it could also be that the one person who manages to move the most that ends up becoming the direction in a way. I never made this thought before, so feel free.
It's interesting that you mention empathy, because people don't generally realize that empathy is a form of imagination. So the reason we're drawn to empathic people is not only because they seem to understand us, but also because we respect the fact that they are using their imagination. And since imagination is the only quality that humans have, really, that animals don't, apparently. Yeah. I know there might be some animal rights people in here who think that animals are imaginative, but I can tell you so far the science doesn't support that idea very well. We are the grand Imagineers of the planet, or the universe as far as we know at the moment. And empathy is one of the products of that, prelude to part 3.
Oh, really?
Anyway, yes.
Okay, almost getting there. But if you worked with some of those people that BJARKE would talk about, and you are not arguably, certainly one of them yourself, one of those people who've been in groups and have helped push that group to another level of achievement, or you've worked with a lot of those people as well. Do you see any, how would you argue with that theory that there's a certain empathic or a certain extra imaginative ability with some people to have that almost circuit role or be an enabler to a certain extent?
Yeah, well, working with groups is very, very interesting, because you realize that they are all completely different. The mechanics within a group are very individual, and that must be true of families as well. I think any human group develops its own particular chemistry, and it's therefore very hard to make any sort of standard assumptions about things. For example, I've worked with bands where it looked like one person was having all the ideas. And you'd think, well, you could get rid of those others, or just employ someone else much cheaper. But it turns out that the guy who never says very much, and who seems to be reading the paper the whole time, he plays in such a way that all these other people are enabled by the fact that he doesn't play very much. You know, he leaves a great big space where other people would fill it up. So part of the character of the music comes from this guy's actual reluctance to take part. It's a very peculiar equation, but I've seen that quite a few times. So what you find yourself doing is, as you start to understand groups, is finding that the absences that a particular group has are as important as the strengths that they have. The things that are missing are as important as the strength. So again, going back to the group Low, who I really enjoyed. The drummer is a girl, also a very good singer actually. So I can't say they're not good musicians. They're really good musicians because they make good music. That's the definition of a good musician, isn't it? They just wouldn't do well at an audition, probably. Well, maybe they would. God, I hope they're not here. I'm not trying to insult them. I'm trying to say that I really like them.
Well, okay. No, I think your point is very clear, and I think it's actually just because the language is so caught up in that classical idea of the competent artist that
just to interrupt you
for
a moment.
Please do.
If you think of the classical paradigm of how things are organized, the orchestra is the absolute model of that. So you have God at the top, then the composer who somehow kind of receives messages from God, then he writes them down, and that goes to the conductor, who of course is an incredibly tempestuous and powerful and arrogant man always, and then he sort of communicates that to the leader of the orchestra and the lead violin, and gradually it sort of filters down to what is actually called the rank and file. Do you know that? That's what they call the people at the poor buggers who sit at the back sawing away all night. So an orchestra is this paradigm of the pyramid, and the only other organizations that still do that really are the church, the classical church, and classical armies. They still retain that kind of picture of organization. Everything else has moved. Everything else is turning into a network. Maybe some architects' offices still have the pyramid. I don't know.
For sure. Like a single creative genius and a sort of an army of minions that are basically executive morons.
Yeah,
like sort of
it's sort of a quite flat pyramid. It's like
exactly. It's more like a T.
That's Protestantism.
T.
That's Protestantism for you. There's only God and all the rest of us.
Well, yeah. This view of how nature was organized was, until Darwin came along, if you asked any Englishman what the structure of the world was, they'd say, well, of course at the top was the Englishman, and next to that you had horses and dogs, then women, then the French, and then barbarians and bacteria or something like that. That would, most of which I still agree with. but that was a way of looking at the world, and it was a way of thinking about how information flowed in the world. So the intelligence was at the top, and the force, if you like, the energy and the power was at the bottom. Well, if you start to think differently from that, and that's exactly what Darwin suggested. When Darwin came along, he showed that the Englishman wasn't at the top of the heap. In fact, the whole of the human race wasn't in a particularly significant part in the heap. The heap was enormous and connected in all sorts of ways, and we were just one of the millions of species involved. And of course, Copernicus a few years earlier had shown that the Earth was not at the center of the universe either. So gradually, the history of humans is the history of us losing our sense of our specialness. We're not special, actually. But what is special, and the only thing that I think is special, is that we have this huge interconnected intelligence now. The fact that we're doing this, no other species has ever done this, has sat down and externalized the contents of their brains to each other and shared them. This is the source of everything for us.
I think maybe since you're talking about like these different ways of allowing a collective of individuals to create in concert, and of course there's like the hierarchical element, and then I was thinking like maybe there is, because one of the things that have struck me by you as a musician is that like sometimes, and you were talking about art and science to begin with, and a lot of people see a dichotomy between those two things. It's either sort of wildly expressive or highly analytical. But when you actually combine the left brain and the right brain, you get the ability to experiment intuitively and make courageous leaps, but also to reflect and sort of and replot a course, and even to transmit what you're doing, not just by leading by example, but actually by putting things into perspective. And I think like the way we, for instance, work in our office is that there is a massive amount of unguided experimentation. So everybody has a license to create. And then we will look at what has been created, and we will only discuss things that have materialized. So I'm not gonna evaluate anyone's idea until they show me, because you can have a million discussions about stuff that's only inside the head. But then once it's there, then any decision that is made, we will reiterate why are we more drawn towards this direction, or why do we want to combine this one with that one? And then so the whole design process becomes a constant re-education of the whole group, in a way, where we together help each other define what is so important here, why is this interesting, what's missing, what are the potentials, the problems, and it becomes a form of empowerment, because even the newest member of the group who just joined the office like 2 weeks ago, during this process ends up getting full ownership, full intellectual ownership of where it is we are going in this direction. And it's not because we are sort of, it's only cognitive processes that guide where we're going. We make most of our choices with the gut, but we constantly reiterate and reformulate the direction that this is taking. So I think maybe it is the left and right brains combined that allows this form of non-hierarchical collaboration.
So, hello. Oh, there I am. I thought I'd lost my voice. So one of the things I think about a lot in terms of collaboration is actually the prelude to the fourth section of my theory.
There you go. Perfect, perfect.
We're like fully on script.
We're getting there.
This was all a plan.
So when people think about the available behaviors that they have, they normally think in terms of controls. What can I control? You know, what can I do? What can I do? Because we have a history as a technological civilization, which we've been for many thousands of years. We have a history of learning to control things, learning what this material is and how to make it and what not to do with it and so on and so on. What we also have, though we don't actually think about it that much, is also a history of learning to surrender successfully, which is to say, learning to go with things, to know how to go with the drift of things. Now, this is something that you see exemplified best of all in surfers. When you watch a surfer, what they do is they use control to get onto a wave, and then they get carried along by it. Well, I think that range of, that repertoire of behaviors, being able to move from control to surrender, is essential for humans to exercise. People who can't do one or the other are stuck. People who can only control are stuck. They don't know how, they're too stiff. They don't know how to go with the flow. They'll break.
I know some of those people.
Yeah. I was one of those people.
but actually, I think there's an interesting point there. Because I mean, I really like this idea of propensity of things, and I also like this idea of the. And again, I think from the point of view of the architect, where the forces of the city are like so vast and so beyond us that we cannot hope to intervene. It's like there are too many political votes, too many angry neighbors, and too much money and too much legislation that we can't control anything, but we can try to sort of navigate the forces that we encounter, and that's why I think quite often when you're talking about artists, there's the idea of the misunderstood genius and the angry young man or woman rebelling against the establishment. So somehow you always associate the avant-garde with a revolution, rebelling against something. And you mentioned Darwin. I really like this idea of being not a revolutionary but an evolutionary, and sort of to first of all, in order for something to evolve, the problem about a revolution is that it's so catastrophic. Yeah. That's why it doesn't happen in Darwinian biology, because if you have a revolution in your DNA, it becomes, then you're born without a heart and then you're dead in a split second. So that's why,
cancer, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's cancer or like fatal mutation. But so therefore, like progressive development and radical new abilities come through very gradual evolutionary steps. Yeah. And I think that's true. So in that sense, just because you can't build it tomorrow, but it would maybe take 20 years, you should still start, and even more reason to start today, because it's going to take 20 years. So like, instead of only doing the things you can do in an hour and then be done with it, like sort of the things that are actually so slow, you have to start with them even sooner to get there.
Okay, so that's the perfect, thank you for that segue, because that's, let's give it a hand. So this talk is called Instruments of Change. Of course, there's a lot of puns in that, and that's funny, but we're actually at a place right now in human history where a lot of change is going on, and we are talking about those changes in a way that is very hierarchical, top-down, revolutionary. All of these models that we've been dissing for the last 40 minutes are actually models that still dominate the way we talk about this. We talk about the changes facing human civilization as revolutions. It seems to me, if you take a step back, that's actually how we've always talked about it. The book of Revelations is talking about one of those coming any day now. And we still talk in apocalyptic terms, and we talk about also we talk about our own role in this as being the people who have destroyed the planet. There's a lot of perfect. That's very generous of you. I have my own. Gentlemen. So when we talk about change in this time, and we actually try to use some of these models that you both advocate, the evolutionary view of it, or even the scenius or the scenic, the scene group version, could we maybe avoid this incredible pessimism? I mean, at these times, the wisest of politicians talk about the world as if it's already done. They talk about tomorrow as we just have to deal with basically human extinction, which is not really, doesn't, you know, it's, I think maybe globalization and globalized media creates an echo chamber with this age-old idea, we're almost dead, which is the human mantra, we're almost dead, is becoming too powerful and almost immobilizing. But yeah, you're involved in the Long Now Foundation. Perfect.
Sorry.
So what do you have any thoughts on that? Yeah.
Well, my friend Danny Hillis, who's a scientist, realized in about 1980 that the future for him was the year 2000. And he realized actually that for nearly everybody, 2000 was a sort of barrier that they hadn't looked past.
I remember that.
Nobody had kind of thought what would happen on 2004 or something like that. 2000 was the sort of, that was it. And he said, the funny thing was, the closer we got to 2000, the more I was surprised because it didn't move. It still stayed 2000. So he came up with this idea of, which you may have heard of, called the clock of the long now, which is something we started in the early 1990s. And the idea was to try to build something that would last for 10,000 years. Not only that would last for 10,000 years, but that would do something for 10,000 years. So it would be a working machine to last for 10,000 years. In fact, a clock was what we decided, and we now are building the first one of those. In fact, it's quite close to being finished. It's 560 feet high, and it's in Texas, in a mountain. Now, when we first started talking about this, people would say, well, that's such a fucking stupid idea. And so you'd say, well, why do you think that's such a stupid idea? And they'd say, but, you know, in 5,000 years, you could have floods and fires, and 10,000 years, you could have twice as many of them, and nuclear. You say, okay, well, have you ever thought about 10,000 years ahead before this conversation? And they'd say, no. So really what we were trying to do was to, rather like I was saying earlier about building things that belong in a future, they aren't here to serve this moment so much as to serve the idea of a future moment. So this was an idea of creating a monument to the thought of thinking in the long term. So that's what we've been doing. And we have this thing called the Long Now Foundation. Oh, thank you. Maybe we'll start a Danish chapter.
I think there's anybody want to join?
But the point about it is it's very slow. You know, we don't do anything very quickly, and we don't make any fast decisions either. In fact, in our 20-odd years of existence, we've done hardly anything, really.
But what kind of perspective
it's like
does...
the what do you call it, the Department of Motor Vehicles in Zootopia, where it's all sloths. I'm the only one who watches Disney
obviously.
cartoons.
But Brian, what perspective does that give you on what I was talking about earlier? This imminent doom thing that's going around these days, where I always try to remind people that human beings in somewhat this physical form, with, as far as we can see, these mental capacities have been existing for 150 or 200,000 years, and a lot has changed. I mean, obviously, so things are going to continue to change. Why are we so afraid of that?
I think we're designed to be afraid. Those of us who are alive today are the descendants of people who were frightened and who acted on their fears, who avoided dangerous situations, who took mortality seriously. The ones who didn't leave descendants by definition. So
except it's not entirely true, because if you stay in Darwinian terms, then actually self-sacrifice is what could save your children, and therefore your genes would survive even though you didn't. So therefore, like bravery, self-sacrifice, sort of non-selfish behavior is also a highly evolved trait. That works on the same mechanism of Darwinism. So in that sense,
that doesn't speak against each other. I think that's, you sacrifice yourself because you want to save someone from the thing you're afraid of.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's actually two very positive traits.
I think they're consistent, actually. But he's quite right that it's not just about the individual looking after themselves. It's about looking after a gene line, basically.
So I don't think we're like in evolutionary terms like a species of like scared little mice. Like we're actually, I really think that bravery and fearlessness is also an attribute, and I think it's also not fair to say that, because if you talk like guys like Hans Rosling, for instance, he's one of the guys who really understands the health of the planet, at least, and how it's evolving. He has this like crusade right now where he's criticizing media to be overemphasizing catastrophe and negativity, because it's essentially what you learn, I guess, in journalist school as being good journalism is
conflict.
A piece of interesting news is a story that someone else doesn't want out. It's not whether it's relevant or if it's useful. It's like whether or not it's going to hurt someone to have it told, and I think that that creates this skew. Because at the same time, the rational optimist Matt Ridley, he argues that he's not an optimist out of naivety. It's just simply when you study the evidence, there is the only rational point of view when you have the long perspective is optimism.
Yeah.
Because we and his theory, and I also believe in this, it's back to maybe this idea of the communal, is that it is because we as humans develop the ability to collaborate on very, very complex projects, more complex than any individual could undertake on their own. And because we somehow unlocked the genius of seniors, we are now constantly getting better and better at what we're doing. And if you look at the mobilization that happened over the last, since the Rio conference 1992, where they developed the term sustainable development, and then like 20 years of failure, but now we had Paris 6 months ago, and if you saw the last TED talk by Al Gore, he's turning into an optimist of all people.
But is it maybe also because we when we look at history, we think history as 50 years. We think of it as maybe if we're really well read, we say 2,000 years. But history is much larger than that. And discovering sustainable development in '92 and maybe effectuating it in 50 years, if that's what it takes to be complete about it, is in historical terms the blink of an eye.
Well, of course, there's another thing happening as well, which is that as our power increases, our power not as individuals and as a species, we are also capable of making much bigger fuck-ups. So we're capable of much bigger successes and much vaster forms of cooperation. I know Matt Ridley, and I have argued with him about this. So I'm not quite as much of an optimist as him. I'm an optimist with a bit more caution than he is. I think he's one of those guys who take acid and think he could fly. That's optimism.
But it might not be that rational. But there is actually, now you're saying this like of planetary scale fuck-ups. Like I think it's maybe more like a reminder that some geologists refer to our present geological era as the Anthropocene, which is this idea of that we are living in a geological area where the mankind or humans have a higher impact on the geological changes of our planet than any other force, including tectonic movement, radiation, etc. And some believe that it started with the Industrial Revolution in the mid-19th century. Some believe that it actually started with sedentary society, when we domesticated plants and animals, and we started growing the land, redirecting water streams, building cities, and we actually created sedentary culture. And with that, we now have such a high impact on our planet that even if we want the responsibility or not, it's already ours. It's like a Spider-Man, and with great power comes great responsibility. That we simply have to.
A source I often quote. Yes,
exactly.
And I think Bjarke, that's going to be the perfect quote to end this talk on. So we have the optimists, but we have the cautionary optimists. And we have the realization that we now have the power to do both great fuck-ups and maybe greater stuff than we've ever done before. And I want to thank you both for coming. Brian Eno, Bjarke Ingels, give them a big hand.
Thanks.
Thank you.